MIA Chandler had always dreamed of flying, not because it was glamorous, but because it gave her freedom. In her mid-20s, she had worked hard to earn her spot as a co-pilot at a regional airline, pushing through the endless hours of training and the skepticism of a male-dominated industry. MIA was determined. For her, it was always about the next flight, the next opportunity, and the next level of success. She had gotten used to the long hours and the isolation of the job. The small, cramped cockpits became her comfort zone. The routine of pre-flight checks and radio calls a rhythm she could rely on. But one thing she hadn't anticipated was the feeling of connection that would spark between her and Julian Kane. Julian was different. He was everything MIA admired and feared in equal measure. In his early 40s, Julian had decades of experience in the skies. His reputation within the airline industry was near legendary. Calm, calculated, and remarkably capable, Julian was the kind of pilot who made complex maneuvers look effortless. But what really made him stand out was his commanding presence. Julian had a way of making everyone around him feel small, but in the most charismatic way possible. Mia's first flight with Julian had been a routine one, but something about the way he moved, the way he carried himself, had caught her off guard. He spoke to her with a respect she hadn't often encountered. He never belittled her or treated her like the young rookie she was. Instead, he seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts, asking her questions, and giving her advice when she needed it. She admired him, yes, but she also felt something else, a strange attraction that she couldn't quite place. Julian, for his part, was equally drawn to MIA. He noticed her intelligence, the fire in her eyes, and how she seemed to focus on every detail with meticulous care. She was different from the other women he knew. She didn't want to be a passenger in her own life. She wanted to soar, to take charge. He admired that about her, even if he didn't fully understand it. MIA told herself it was just a fleeting connection, a simple professional respect. After all, Julian was married. His wife, Claire, was always by his side at company events, a beautiful woman who carried an air of cold detachment. Claire was everything Julian had ever needed, on paper. She had money, status, and a family name that opened doors. But the longer MIA worked with Julian, the more she realized that their marriage was a facade. They were cordial, polite even, but there was no fire. There was no passion. And as the days passed, MIA began to feel herself drawn into Julian's orbit in ways she hadn't expected. Each flight brought them closer, and the conversations between them began to stray from aviation to more personal topics. Mia's life, her ambitions, her struggles were all laid bare for him, and slowly, Julian started to reveal parts of himself she hadn't expected. At first, MIA tried to ignore the growing tension between them, convinced that it was nothing more than a fleeting attraction. She had come to the airline to succeed, not to get involved in a dangerous relationship. But every time Julian smiled at her or gave her a compliment, her resolve weakened. There was something magnetic about him, something she couldn't explain. He was a mystery she couldn't unravel, and that only made him more irresistible. Mia's personal life was a mess. She had recently broken up with her longtime boyfriend, Ethan, who had been distant and emotionally unavailable. She had loved him once, but over time, their relationship had become a routine, an endless series of texts and unspoken resentments. It had left her emotionally exhausted, but she didn't know how to let go. Ethan's final message had been short and final. MIA, we need to talk. I can't keep doing this. It's too much. Goodbye. The words echoed in her head, and for weeks she had clung to them, questioning whether she was the problem. Now, faced with Julian's attention, she found herself wanting something different, something alive, something real. But she had always prided herself on being rational, on keeping control. So when the thought of Julian crossed her mind, she pushed it away. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. Julian had been married to Claire for nearly 15 years. On the surface, their life together was perfect. They had a grand house in the suburbs, high-end cars, and a lifestyle that many people envied. But beneath the surface, Julian knew the truth. His marriage was a shell of what it had once been. Claire was distant, focused only on the social obligations that came with being married to a man of Julian's stature. Their conversations had become sparse, and their intimacy was non-existent. Julian tried to ignore the emptiness, throwing himself into his work, into his reputation. But even the high-flying world of aviation couldn't fill the void. The emptiness inside him began to gnaw at him, especially when he saw Mia's passion and energy. She was young, vibrant, and hungry for success. She was everything his wife wasn't, and Julian couldn't help but find himself drawn to her. As the days went by, the lines between professional respect and personal interest blurred. Mia began to notice how Julian's compliments lingered a little too long, how his touch seemed more intentional, how the moments of casual conversation began to feel like private exchanges. She couldn't ignore it any longer. They were flirting, and she was letting it happen. One night, after a particularly grueling flight, they found themselves alone at the hotel bar. Julian had a glass of whiskey in hand, his tie loosened, his jacket discarded. Mia sat across from him, her own glass of wine forgotten. They had spoken about everything and nothing, about flying, about life. But the air between them was thick with unsaid words. For a long moment, they sat in silence, their eyes meeting, a silent understanding passing between them. And then, as if something had shifted in the atmosphere, Julian leaned forward, his voice low. "I don't think I've ever met anyone quite like you, Mia." Her heart raced, but she didn't pull away. She wanted to. She should have. But something in her, something deep inside, whispered to her that maybe, just maybe, this was what she had been waiting for. The next day, Mia couldn't shake the feeling of Julian's presence. Every time they crossed paths, whether in the hangar or on the tarmac, her pulse quickened. She told herself it was nothing, just an attraction. She had been with Ethan for years, and that was over now. But every time Julian's hand brushed against hers, her heart fluttered in a way it hadn't in years. That night, after the plane had landed and the crew had checked into the hotel, they found themselves alone in the lounge. The drinks were flowing, the tension between them palpable. Mia couldn't deny it any longer. There was no avoiding the pull she felt toward him. Julian took a step closer, his breath warm against her ear as he whispered, "You're the most beautiful woman in this room, Mia. And I know you're not used to hearing that, but it's true." Mia turned her head, meeting his gaze. She had never heard words like that before. She had been loved, yes, but never in a way that made her feel as though she were the only woman in the world. Without thinking, without considering the consequences, she kissed him. As the days passed, Mia found herself pulled deeper into Julian's world. A world of luxury, power, and an intoxicating charm that made it nearly impossible for her to see things clearly. The relationship began to shift from flirtation to something far more dangerous, as stolen moments turned into secret meetings, and fleeting touches morphed into desperate embraces. Every flight with Julian felt like a step further into a web of tension and desire. It started with subtle exchanges, whispered words during layovers, a lingering gaze across the cockpit, moments when their eyes met for too long and the world outside seemed to vanish. The chemistry between them was undeniable, a slow-burning fuse that was only a matter of time before it ignited. They began to steal away for moments of privacy during layovers, meeting in quiet corners of airport lounges or slipping away to the anonymity of hotel rooms. Mia felt alive in a way she had never experienced. The rush of adrenaline from the flights was nothing compared to the raw, intense thrill she felt when she was with Julian. But even as her body craved his touch, a deep conflict gnawed at her. She knew what they were doing was wrong. She wasn't blind to the fact that Julian was married, to Claire, a woman who barely seemed to notice her husband's absence. Yet Mia couldn't stop herself. Each stolen kiss, each heated touch, only deepened her feelings for him. It was in a hotel room in Chicago, after a particularly long flight, that Mia and Julian crossed a line that could never be undone. The air between them had crackled with unspoken words all day. Julian had been quiet, introspective, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced with something darker, something Mia couldn't quite place but felt drawn to nonetheless. When they entered the hotel room, he turned to her, his eyes intense, almost searching. "Mia," he whispered, his voice low. "I need you to know something." She swallowed, her heart pounding in her chest. "What?" "You're special," Julian said, stepping closer, his hand reaching for hers. "I've never met anyone like you. You're more than just a colleague, you know? You understand me in a way no one else does." His words, simple yet potent, made her heart race. MIA had never been one to believe in fairy tales, but the way Julian spoke, with such sincerity, made her feel like she was the only woman in the world who mattered. She wanted to believe him, to throw caution to the wind and embrace whatever this was. But a small voice in the back of her mind warned her not to. The red flags were there, the reality of his marriage, the secrecy, the lies. But when Julian kissed her, all that seemed to fade away. The kiss was electric. It wasn't just passion. It was the culmination of every whispered conversation, every lingering glance. It was everything MIA had been holding back for weeks. In that moment, she couldn't remember why she had been so hesitant. She couldn't remember why she had been fighting it. All that mattered was the feeling of Julian's hands on her, his breath against her skin, and the intense, dizzying rush that followed. As their bodies came together, MIA could feel the weight of her guilt, but it was drowned out by the overwhelming sensation of being wanted, of being seen in a way that she had never been before. For the first time in a long time, she felt alive, truly alive, not just as a co-pilot, not just as someone striving to prove herself, but as a woman desired, cherished, even if it was for only a moment. In the days following that night, MIA and Julian found themselves drawn together more frequently. It wasn't just the physical connection anymore. There was something deeper forming between them. Julian began to make MIA feel like she was the center of his world. He would check in with her during the layovers, offer gentle praise for her flying skills, and reassure her about her future at the airline. "You have something special, MIA. I can see it in the way you fly, in the way you handle yourself in the cockpit. I've been around a lot of pilots, but none of them have the passion you do," Julian would say, his voice steady, but always tinged with the quiet admiration that made Mia's heart flutter. Each compliment felt like a thread, pulling her closer to him. He made her feel like she mattered, like she wasn't just another face in the crew, but someone who had the potential to rise to the top. In many ways, it felt like he was positioning her, guiding her career not just as a mentor but as someone who had the power to give her what she wanted. More flights, more opportunities, more chances to prove herself. But as the months went by, MIA began to see a darker side to Julian, one that she had previously overlooked. The same charm that made him magnetic could also be manipulative. Slowly, she realized that Julian wasn't just mentoring her, he was controlling her. His influence over her career grew as their relationship did. He'd casually mention how much he had fought for her to get certain assignments, as though her success was a direct result of his intervention. He'd put in a good word with the higher-ups, making sure she was given the best flights, the best routes. In return, MIA was expected to give him her undivided attention, her loyalty, not just in the cockpit, but in private as well. At first, MIA dismissed it as a harmless gesture. After all, he had helped her climb the ladder in ways she couldn't have achieved on her own. But the deeper she got into the affair, the more she realized the strings he pulled, the expectations he had. She wasn't just another pilot anymore. She was his, in every sense of the word. MIA had always prided herself on her independence, but now, more than ever, she was questioning whether she had compromised that for Julian's affection. Was it the promise of success that kept her tethered to him? Or was it the connection they shared, the illicit thrill of a forbidden romance that pulled her in despite her better judgment? At the same time, Mia's personal life outside of her relationship with Julian began to unravel. Her friends, particularly Sarah, noticed the changes. Sarah had always been the first to call out when MIA was acting differently, and now she was concerned. MIA had stopped answering texts, missed dinner plans, and seemed distracted during their few moments together. "You've been acting weird, MIA," Sarah said one evening when they finally managed to meet up. "Are you seeing someone? Oh, is it something else?" MIA hesitated, the weight of Julian's name hanging in the air between them. She couldn't bring herself to tell Sarah the truth. Not yet. Not until she could figure out what was happening inside her own heart. So, instead, she offered a vague excuse, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Just work stuff. It's been crazy lately. But Sarah wasn't convinced. She had seen the signs before. MIA was falling for someone, and Sarah could sense the danger that lurked in that attraction. Meanwhile, Julian's wife, Claire, remained blissfully unaware of the affair. She was preoccupied with her own world, events, charity functions, and her social status. Julian's absence didn't seem to affect her at all. In many ways, they had become strangers living under the same roof, their marriage an empty shell of what it once was. This suited Julian just fine. He had his escape, his distraction in MIA, and in her, he found what he had been missing for years: excitement, passion, and a sense of control. Julian was in his element, balancing his public life as a successful pilot with his private affairs. No one would ever suspect him, not with the carefully crafted persona he had built over the years. As the affair deepened, so too did Mia's inner turmoil. She couldn't ignore the growing sense of guilt that gnawed at her every time she saw Julian, every time she felt the weight of their secrecy. But there was also a part of her that couldn't stop herself from wanting him, from wanting the life he promised. She had been working for years to build a career, and Julian was the key to that, whether she liked it or not. The affair was no longer just about lust. It was about power. It was about control. And MIA was beginning to realize that her feelings for Julian might not be as pure as she thought. But in the quiet moments between their passionate encounters, she began to wonder, was she in love with him? Or had she simply fallen victim to the excitement, the danger of loving someone she knew she shouldn't? As the stakes grew higher and the affair deepened, Mia's life began to spiral, caught between the world she was building with Julian and the life she had once envisioned for herself. And one day, the pregnancy test sat on the edge of Mia's bathroom sink, mocking her with its faintly visible result. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the thin pink line, the one that meant everything and nothing all at once. The reality of what it meant was still sinking in, and the nausea that had plagued her for days only made it worse. She had known something was off for weeks, but she never expected it to come to this. MIA had always been cautious. She had always taken care of herself, focused on her career, her ambitions, the things that mattered. But now, as she stood there, holding the small plastic stick in her trembling hands, she realized her life was about to be irrevocably altered. She was pregnant. And the father was Julian Kane. Mia's mind raced as she sank onto the edge of the bathtub, her head spinning with a mixture of panic and disbelief. How could this happen? She barely even knew how to think about the future now. A child. Her career. Julian. The tangle of emotions that filled her chest made it hard to breathe. The worst part was, she knew deep down that the decision she had to make wasn't as simple as keeping the baby or not. There were too many variables at play, too many consequences. She thought of Julian, his warmth, his presence, the way he made her feel like she was the only person who mattered. He was always there when she needed him, offering support, guidance, and affection. But then, the thought of his wife, Claire, came crashing into her mind. MIA felt a sickening twist in her stomach. Julian wasn't just her lover, he was also someone else's husband. And now she was carrying his child. MIA sat there for what felt like hours, trying to calm herself, trying to figure out what to do. She knew she couldn't hide this forever. But telling Julian? She wasn't sure she was ready for the conversation, or for what his response would be. When Julian showed up at her apartment later that evening, MIA had already made up her mind. She couldn't keep this to herself any longer. She couldn't bear the weight of it. But she wasn't ready for the coldness in his eyes when she told him. MIA, Julian's voice was low, almost detached, as she looked up at him. You're pregnant. She nodded, her heart sinking in her chest as she saw the flicker of something unreadable pass through his face. For a brief moment, it felt like she was speaking to a stranger. Look, MIA, Julian began, his tone firm but controlled. We can't let this get out. You know that, right? His words were sharp, cutting through the air between them. MIA felt a rush of heat flood her face. She had expected him to be upset, maybe even angry, but not like this. Julian, I don't know what to do. I can't. I'll take care of it, he interrupted, his voice cold now. We'll handle this quietly. But you need to keep this between us. Do you understand? Mia's throat tightened. She had thought she knew Julian, his charisma, his charm, his wit. But now, seeing the ruthless edge in his eyes, she was starting to realize that she had only ever seen what he wanted her to see. She had trusted him, but now she wondered just how much he had been controlling her all along. Take care of it, Mia whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and disbelief. What does that mean, Julian? He stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder in what was meant to be a reassuring gesture, but the coldness in his touch made her flinch. You'll have the option of keeping it, of course, but we need to keep this quiet. For both of us. We can't let Claire find out. You can't talk to anyone about this, Mia. It has to be just you and me. Mia's heart clenched in her chest. Was that it? Was this the extent of his concern? He wasn't offering to be there for her, to help her figure out the right path. He was offering silence. He was offering secrecy. And in that secrecy, he was tightening his grip on her, making her feel like she had no choice but to comply. I'll support you, he added, his voice softening slightly, though the underlying command remained. I'm not asking you to do this alone. But I'm not leaving Claire. And you can't expect me to. I'll do what's necessary to help, but this stays between us. No one else can know. Understood. Mia swallowed hard, nodding in agreement, though every fiber of her being screamed in protest. She didn't know what she had expected, but it certainly hadn't been this. She had hoped for some kind of solace, for some hint that he was in this with her, that he might even choose her, choose their child, over the life he had built with his wife. But his words made it painfully clear that Mia's place in his world was precarious at best. I understand, she said quietly, though her voice wavered. But the deeper Mia fell into Julian's world, the harder it became to break free. She tried to find comfort in her career, throwing herself into work, but she couldn't escape the reality of the child growing inside her. And every time she looked at Julian, she felt a sickening mixture of desire and dread. He had gotten what he wanted: control over her, over their relationship, and over her future. The more Mia tried to convince herself that this was just a temporary situation, the more she realized how far gone she was. The pregnancy wasn't just a consequence of their affair, it was a symbol of the power Julian had over her, the way he had manipulated her into believing she had no other choice but to follow his lead. Her once ambitious dreams of flying, of breaking free of the constraints that had defined her life, were slowly being replaced by a different kind of fear. A fear that Julian's grip on her life would only tighten, and that no matter what choices she made, she would never escape from the web he had so carefully woven around her. Mia couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was off. The pregnancy, Julian's increasing control, the secrecy, it all felt like too much. But as the days passed, a darker shadow began to grow in her mind. Something in Julian's past didn't add up. Mia had always trusted him, but with every new layer of manipulation he revealed, she started to wonder just how much she really knew about the man she had allowed to dictate the course of her life. Late one night, after Julian had left her apartment, Mia sat at her desk, staring at her laptop. She needed answers. Desperately. She began searching his name, digging deeper than ever before. She found his professional profile, the glowing references from colleagues and friends, the public accolades. But that wasn't what she was looking for. She dug deeper, combing through old news articles, interviews, and any scraps of information she could find. The deeper she went, the more troubling the details became. Mia stumbled across an old news report from a few years ago, detailing the disappearance of a woman named Lily Matthews. She had been one of Julian's ex-girlfriends, someone who had kept a low profile in the media, but who had vanished without a trace after their brief affair ended. At first, Mia dismissed it. There were hundreds of women who had crossed paths with Julian, right? But something about the article caught her eye. The investigation into Lily's disappearance had been inconclusive, but several of her friends had mentioned that Lily had been disturbed by Julian's behavior just before she vanished. One particular source claimed that Lily had expressed fear that Julian was becoming obsessed with her. But there was no evidence linking him to her disappearance. At least, none that had made it to the public eye. Mia's hands trembled as she clicked through the article, her mind racing. She couldn't ignore the rising sense of dread that gripped her chest. What if Julian wasn't just some charming, controlling man who had a hold on her? What if this wasn't the first time he'd done something like this? Her thoughts turned to the stories Sarah had told her over the years. Women who had come and gone from Julian's life, all with similar stories of broken hearts and bitter endings. MIA had brushed them off, assuming they were just rumors or jealousy. But now, with Lily's name haunting her thoughts, MIA began to see a darker pattern. Her pulse quickened as she found more stories of women who had been involved with Julian, short-term lovers or colleagues who had been silenced, their careers or reputations destroyed when they tried to walk away. There was one recurring theme. They all seemed to disappear, whether emotionally, professionally, or in some cases, physically. Mia's stomach churned. How many more women had there been? And why hadn't she seen the warning signs? Was she just another pawn in Julian's twisted game? The next day, MIA couldn't focus at work. The weight of her discovery pressed down on her, her thoughts constantly drifting back to the missing women, the rumors, and the fear that Julian had used and discarded them like so many before her. She tried to push it all aside, tried to convince herself she was overthinking things. But when she got home, the uneasy feeling returned, gnawing at her until it was unbearable. She decided to confront Julian. When he arrived that evening, he was his usual charming self, as though nothing was wrong. He kissed her on the cheek and poured them both a glass of wine, but MIA couldn't bring herself to smile. She had to do this. She had to ask him the questions she had been avoiding for so long. "Julian," she began, her voice shaky but determined. "We need to talk." He looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What's on your mind, MIA?" MIA took a deep breath. "I've been looking into your past. Your ex-girlfriends, the things that happened with them, and with Lily Matthews. Where is she, Julian? What happened to her?" A flicker of tension passed across his face, but it was gone so quickly that MIA almost thought she imagined it. He set his glass down and walked over to her, his expression turning soft. "MIA, I know this is all a lot for you to take in. You're under pressure, and I get it. But you don't need to look into my past. That's not who I am anymore." Mia's heart raced. "I need to know the truth. You've been manipulating me, controlling me, and I—" "Stop," Julian cut her off, his voice suddenly dark. "You're imagining things, MIA. This isn't you. You're just overwhelmed by everything. The pregnancy, the stress. This is a temporary thing. And it's just you and me now. We're a family, MIA. You're the only woman who matters to me." But MIA could hear the lie in his voice. The soft reassurance that slipped too easily into something colder. He was trying to gaslight her. Again. "MIA," he continued, his tone shifting to something more sinister. "You can't go digging into my past. You wouldn't like what you find. Trust me. You're just making things harder for yourself." MIA froze, every muscle in her body locking in place. The warmth of his words felt like a cold slap now, and the smile on his face twisted into something almost predatory. "I don't want to hurt you," Julian said, though his eyes burned with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "But if you keep pushing this, if you keep questioning me, you'll regret it." Mia's chest tightened, her breath shallow as Julian stepped closer to her. "I've given you everything. My career, my protection. But you're risking it all now, MIA. You're playing with fire." MIA stepped back, trembling. She had heard the veiled threat in his words, the subtle promise that he would destroy her if she didn't fall in line. The fear in her heart deepened, mixing with the sick realization that he was capable of anything. The next few days were tense. MIA tried to act normal around Julian, but the fear never left her. She felt like she was walking on eggshells, afraid to say the wrong thing, afraid to do anything that might set him off. Every time he looked at her, she saw that darkness beneath his charming exterior. But the worst part was that MIA couldn't shake the feeling that she was trapped. She was pregnant with his child, and she had no idea how to get out of this toxic, suffocating relationship. Julian had made it clear that leaving him would mean the end of everything she had worked for. Her career, her reputation, and perhaps even her life. One evening, after a long flight, Julian was particularly cold. He barely acknowledged MIA when they returned to their hotel room. The tension between them was unbearable, but MIA knew she had to confront him again. "I need you to be honest with me," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "What happened to Lily Matthews?" Julian looked up at her, his jaw tightening. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something truly dangerous in his eyes. "You don't know when to stop, do you?" he murmured, his voice low and dangerous. "I told you. You're better off not knowing. Leave the past where it belongs. I'll make sure you're taken care of. You just need to trust me." MIA knew the time had come to make a decision. She had put it off for too long, but her heart had begun to break under the weight of the lie she was living. Julian's suffocating control, the lies, the manipulation, it was all too much. And now, with the pregnancy, the stakes had never been higher. MIA had spent nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she was strong enough to escape the life she had fallen into. She had tried to convince herself that she was in love with Julian, that the passion, the excitement of their secret affair, was enough to justify the manipulation and the emotional abuse. But the truth had become clearer with each passing day. She was not in love with him. She was in fear of him. The pregnancy had forced her to confront the reality of her situation. She couldn't live in this twisted relationship any longer. She couldn't bring a child into this world and into Julian's control. MIA decided to take the first step toward freedom, even if it scared her to death. It was late, just after another exhausting flight, when Julian came to her apartment. He had become a fixture in her life, his presence lingering like a shadow. MIA had been waiting for him, steeling herself for what she had to do. When he arrived, his usual easy charm was in place. He kissed her cheek lightly, his hands already on her waist, pulling her close. But MIA pulled back, her heart pounding in her chest. "Julian, we need to talk," she said, her voice shaking, but steady. His smile faltered, and the tension in the room thickened. "What's wrong, MIA?" She took a deep breath. "I can't do this anymore. I'm going public. I'm ending things with you. I'm going to tell Claire everything. I'm going to be honest with everyone, with myself. I'm pregnant with your child, Julian, and I can't keep living this lie. I'm not going to be your secret anymore." Julian's expression shifted in an instant, his eyes narrowing, his jaw tightening. The mask of charm slipped away, and the coldness beneath it rose to the surface. For a moment, MIA thought she saw a flicker of something almost animalistic in his gaze. "Don't you dare," he said, his voice low and menacing. MIA held her ground, though her heart hammered in her chest. "I can't keep living under your control. You've lied to me. You've manipulated me. I'm not going to be part of your twisted little world anymore." Julian moved towards her with an unsettling calmness. He reached out to touch her arm, but his grip was tight, almost bruising. "You think you can just walk away, MIA? Do you really think it's that easy?" MIA pulled her arm away, a flicker of fear running through her, but she stood firm. "I'm not afraid of you, Julian. This is over." For a moment, there was silence between them, the tension palpable. But then Julian let out a slow, humorless laugh. His eyes were cold now, as though he were looking at a problem to be solved. "You don't know what you're saying," he said, his voice steady, but there was something darker behind it. "You think you can just walk away and everything will be fine? You think I'll let you ruin everything?" Mia's breath caught in her throat. The rage she saw in his eyes was frightening, but it was the emptiness behind it that chilled her to the bone. "You have no idea what you're up against," Julian continued, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. "You think you can leave me, expose me, ruin my life? I made you, MIA. I gave you everything. And if you think you can just throw that all away, you're making a huge mistake. You'll regret it." MIA recoiled, her knees shaking, but she didn't back down. "I don't care what you think. I'm not your property, Julian. I'm not some woman you can control and discard when it suits you. I'm done. His eyes flashed, his calm facade crumbling. You think you're done? You think you're going to just walk away with your life? Your career? You'll be nothing without me. No one will believe you. They'll think you're crazy, MIA. And the moment you try to expose me, I'll ruin you. Everything you've worked for will be destroyed. No one will ever trust you again. MIA felt her chest tighten. Her head spun with the weight of his threats. She had never seen this side of him before. The cold, calculating man who saw people as tools to be used and discarded. For a moment, she felt a flicker of doubt. Was he right? Could she really walk away from everything she had known? But she knew one thing. She couldn't let him win. She couldn't let him keep controlling her life, controlling her future. She took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of strength she had left. I'll go to the police if I have to. I'll go public. You can't keep me quiet forever. Julian's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. You think anyone will believe you? I'm a respected pilot, MIA. I'm untouchable. But you'll just be a girl who made a mistake. A girl who thought she could take me down. They'll laugh at you. No one will listen. MIA stumbled back, her body trembling, her thoughts in disarray. Her mind screamed for escape, but her heart ached with the truth. She was stuck. She was trapped in a nightmare of her own making. Every exit had been closed off by Julian, every escape plan thwarted by his manipulative behavior. I won't let you destroy me, Julian, she whispered, but even as the words left her lips, she wasn't sure if she believed them. Julian closed the distance between them, his hands now gripping her shoulders with an almost terrifying intensity. You're already destroyed, he said softly, his voice dripping with venom. You just don't know it yet. You're mine, MIA. You always will be. The weight of his words crushed her chest, and she fought to stay upright, the tears threatening to spill. She had no idea what to do, where to go, or how to escape this prison of lies. She had tried to be strong, tried to take control of her life, but Julian was a force beyond her control. The days that followed were a blur of fear, guilt, and emotional turmoil. MIA tried to continue with her normal life, but the terror of Julian's threats weighed heavily on her every step. He called her constantly, texted her incessantly, each message more possessive and manipulative than the last. Each time they spoke, he tried to convince her that leaving him would ruin her. MIA could feel herself breaking down. She had no one to turn to. Her friends had been pushed away, her family kept at arm's length. The loneliness was suffocating, the isolation unbearable. But deep down, MIA knew that if she didn't find a way to leave, she would lose herself completely. Mia's emotional breakdown came suddenly. It wasn't just the pregnancy or the weight of the lies that had pushed her over the edge. It was the realization that she had no control over her own life anymore. She had been so desperate to make the right decision, to break free, but now all she could do was cry. Her world had become a prison, and the man who had promised to love her had turned into her jailer. The tears were relentless, pouring down her face as she sat on the edge of her bed, her body shaking. She had been manipulated, controlled, and used by Julian, and now she had nowhere to go. There was no way out. She was trapped in a web of lies, and the harder she fought, the deeper she seemed to fall. Mia's heart raced as she sifted through the documents she had managed to gather. The search for answers had consumed her in the last few days, an obsession that had replaced everything else in her life. She had never imagined herself as someone who would investigate a man she loved, but the man she had once known as Julian Kane was slipping away, and she was terrified of what she might find. The clues had been scattered, obscured behind layers of lies and years of deception. But MIA was relentless. Late one night, buried in a dark corner of a local library, she uncovered a file tucked away under the name Lily Matthews, a name she'd come across in whispers, in hushed conversations that barely grazed her ears when she first met Julian. Lily Matthews had been a beautiful, ambitious woman, one who had been involved with Julian years ago, before MIA. A woman who had vanished one night, only to be found weeks later, her body dumped in a remote area, her death ruled as an accident. But something about the circumstances of Lily's death felt wrong. There were inconsistencies, oddities that didn't make sense. A botched investigation, a lack of evidence, and an unnerving silence from everyone who had known Lily. Mia's hands trembled as she went through the evidence. Julian's name was mentioned several times in the records. He had been the last person to see Lily alive. They had fought during their last meeting, a witness had testified, but no one had connected the dots. The final blow came when MIA found an old phone message from Julian to Lily, dated just days before her disappearance. "If you leave me, I'll make sure no one will ever find you," the message read. The coldness of the words sent a chill down Mia's spine, and for the first time, she realized the full extent of Julian's obsession. Her thoughts spiraled. This was no accident. Lily hadn't simply vanished. She had been silenced. And the man MIA had fallen for, her lover, her mentor, was a killer. The confrontation took place in the dead of night, when the world outside seemed as quiet and empty as MIA felt inside. She had called Julian to meet her at her apartment, her heart pounding in her chest. She had found the truth, and now she had to hear him say it. Julian stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. But as soon as MIA spoke, as soon as she mentioned Lily Matthews, his face twisted, revealing a flash of something darker. "I know what you did," MIA whispered, her voice cracking with fear. "Lily Matthews, she didn't just disappear. You killed her." Julian didn't flinch. His gaze darkened, and he stepped closer. "It was an accident," he said, his voice cold and even, as though the words were nothing more than an inconvenience. "She got too emotional. She was unstable. I tried to end it with her, but she wouldn't let me go. She was threatening to ruin everything." MIA felt her stomach twist. She had known it was bad. But this was something she could never have anticipated. Julian didn't express regret. He didn't feel sorrow. He was simply explaining what had happened, as though it was nothing more than a minor inconvenience in his life. "I never wanted to hurt her," he continued, but MIA could hear the lie in his voice. "She just, well, you know how it is. People can get out of hand." The weight of his words settled on MIA like a cold stone. He wasn't apologizing. He wasn't even remorseful. He was rationalizing it, justifying it. Mia's hands shook as she realized the horrifying truth. Julian had not loved her. He had wanted to control her, to own her, to keep her, just as he had done with Lily and every other woman who had come before. "I'm not her, Julian," MIA said, her voice trembling but firm. "I won't let you control me like you did her. I'm not your property." For the first time, Julian's mask cracked. A flash of anger crossed his features, but it was quickly replaced with a cold, calculating look. "You don't understand, MIA. I do this because I love you. And if you try to leave me, I'll make sure you never get away. No one will ever love you the way I do." Mia's blood ran cold as she realized that Julian didn't love her. He owned her, and he was willing to kill anyone who threatened his control. MIA had reached a breaking point. After everything she had uncovered, Julian's past, his manipulative ways, and the terrible truth of Lily Matthews' death, she could no longer stay. The weight of the lies, the betrayal, and the escalating fear had pushed her to the edge. She had made her decision. She would leave Julian for good, take the baby, and escape this hell. She would go to the authorities, expose him for who he truly was, and end the nightmare once and for all. Her heart was heavy with the decision. The past months had been filled with moments of tenderness and terror, moments of passion and pain. But now, all she wanted was to be free, to be safe, to protect her unborn child. MIA had carefully planned her escape. She would meet Julian one last time, in a secluded location, under the pretense of discussing the future. She would tell him she was done, that she was leaving, and that he would never control her again. There would be no turning back. She didn't expect the meeting to go smoothly. In fact, she feared for her life. But she wasn't prepared for the horror that was about to unfold. The meeting was arranged at a secluded hotel, a quiet place far from prying eyes. Julian had insisted on the location, making it seem like an opportunity for them to talk things through in private. MIA knew it was a trap, but she couldn't back down now. She arrived early, her nerves on edge, her stomach twisting in knots. She wasn't sure what would happen, whether Julian would accept her decision, or whether he would explode. She didn't expect him to be waiting for her. As she entered the dimly lit hotel room, Julian was already there, standing by the window, his back turned. For a moment, it seemed like the man she had once known. A man who had made her feel special, who had charmed his way into her heart. But as soon as he turned to face her, that illusion shattered. "You really think you can just leave me, MOA?" Julian's voice was cold, but there was something darker lurking beneath it. "You think you can just walk away from all of this, from me?" MIA stood her ground, her voice trembling but determined. "I'm done, Julian. I'm done with the lies, the manipulation. I'm taking the baby, and I'm leaving you." For a moment, Julian didn't move. His gaze was steady, but his expression was unreadable. Then, like a switch had been flipped, his demeanor changed. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched, and before MIA could react, he was on her. It happened so quickly. One moment, Julian was standing at a distance, and the next, he was on her, his hands wrapped around her throat. MIA gasped, struggling to breathe, as her body reacted in a desperate attempt to fight back. But Julian was too strong. "You think you can destroy me?" he hissed, his voice low and filled with venom. "You think you can take everything away from me, MIA? You're nothing without me. No one will ever love you like I do." Mia's vision blurred as she clawed at his hands, trying to pull them away. She kicked, but it was futile. She was trapped in his grip, suffocating under the weight of his rage. Her mind raced as her breath grew shallower. "I won't let him win. I won't let him take my life." But as her strength faded, the thought of her baby, the life she was carrying, kept her fighting. With what little energy she had left, she managed to croak out a few words, her voice weak and strained. "Please, don't hurt the baby." Julian's expression faltered for a fraction of a second, but his grip only tightened. He whispered into her ear, the words chilling her to the core. "You were never going to leave me. Not alive." And with that, MIA Chandler's world went black. MIA had reached a breaking point. After everything she had uncovered, Julian's past, his manipulative ways, and the terrible truth of Lily Matthews' death, she could no longer stay. The weight of the lies, the betrayal, and the escalating fear had pushed her to the edge. She had made her decision. She would leave Julian for good, take the baby, and escape this hell. She would go to the authorities, expose him for who he truly was, and end the nightmare once and for all. Her heart was heavy with the decision. The past months had been filled with moments of tenderness and terror, moments of passion and pain. But now, all she wanted was to be free, to be safe, to protect her unborn child. MIA had carefully planned her escape. She would meet Julian one last time, in a secluded location, under the pretense of discussing the future. She would tell him she was done, that she was leaving, and that he would never control her again. There would be no turning back. She didn't expect the meeting to go smoothly. In fact, she feared for her life. But she wasn't prepared for the horror that was about to unfold. The meeting was arranged at a secluded hotel, a quiet place far from prying eyes. Julian had insisted on the location, making it seem like an opportunity for them to talk things through in private. MIA knew it was a trap, but she couldn't back down now. She arrived early, her nerves on edge, her stomach twisting in knots. She wasn't sure what would happen, whether Julian would accept her decision, or whether he would explode. She didn't expect him to be waiting for her. As she entered the dimly lit hotel room, Julian was already there, standing by the window, his back turned. For a moment, it seemed like the man she had once known. A man who had made her feel special, who had charmed his way into her heart. But as soon as he turned to face her, that illusion shattered. "You really think you can just leave me, MOA?" Julian's voice was cold, but there was something darker lurking beneath it. "You think you can just walk away from all of this, from me?" MIA stood her ground, her voice trembling but determined. "I'm done, Julian. I'm done with the lies, the manipulation. I'm taking the baby, and I'm leaving you." For a moment, Julian didn't move. His gaze was steady, but his expression was unreadable. Then, like a switch had been flipped, his demeanor changed. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched, and before MIA could react, he was on her. It happened so quickly. One moment, Julian was standing at a distance, and the next, he was on her, his hands wrapped around her throat. MIA gasped, struggling to breathe, as her body reacted in a desperate attempt to fight back. But Julian was too strong, too fast. "You think you can destroy me?" he hissed, his voice low and filled with venom. "You think you can take everything away from me? MIA? You're nothing without me. No one will ever love you like I do." Mia's vision blurred as she clawed at his hands, trying to pull them away. She kicked, but it was futile. She was trapped in his grip, suffocating under the weight of his rage. Her mind raced as her breath grew shallower. "I won't let him win. I won't let him take my life." But as her strength faded, the thought of her baby, the life she was carrying, kept her fighting. With what little energy she had left, she managed to croak out a few words, her voice weak and strained. "Please, don't hurt the baby." Julian's expression faltered for a fraction of a second, but his grip only tightened. He whispered into her ear, the words chilling her to the core. "You were never going to leave me. Not alive." And with that, MIA Chandler's world went black. The news of Mia's death spread quickly, sending shockwaves through the aviation community and her circle of friends. Everyone who knew MIA was left with unanswered questions. How had this bright, ambitious woman, someone with so much promise, ended up dead in a remote hotel room? And why had she been there in the first place? Detective Amanda Ward was assigned to the case. She arrived at the crime scene with a sense of foreboding. There were signs of a struggle in the hotel room, and Mia's body was found lying on the floor, her hand still clutching her phone. What caught the detective's attention was the phone itself. MIA had managed to record the final moments of her life. As Amanda reviewed the footage, her heart sank. The last thing MIA had said was a plea to protect her unborn child. The chilling images showed Julian Kane, calm and unrepentant, strangling MIA with a brutal efficiency that shocked even the seasoned detective. Julian's face, twisted in rage, was frozen on the screen, and it was clear that MIA had not only been his lover, but his possession, a woman he would kill to control. Amanda's investigation took a darker turn when she discovered Julian's long history of controlling behavior. Evidence of his previous affairs and the lengths he went to keep his victims silent began to surface. Julian had always been a man who preferred to control his relationships with an iron fist. His marriage to Claire, his interactions with MIA, it was all a part of a pattern. And now, MIA had paid the ultimate price for trying to escape. The investigation into Julian's past was relentless. Detective Ward uncovered police records about Lily Matthews' disappearance, a woman who had vanished under suspicious circumstances, just like MIA. The connection was undeniable. Julian Kane was a predator, and MIA was not his first victim. But there was another twist to the story. Claire, Julian's wife, had always remained in the background, quiet and distant, oblivious to her husband's infidelities. That is, until Mia's death. Claire had long suspected that something wasn't right, but she had never imagined the depths of Julian's lies. When Claire found out the truth, her world shattered. She learned about Julian's affairs, his involvement in Mia's murder, and the twisted obsession that had driven him to kill. The shock of the revelation was overwhelming, but Claire knew she couldn't stay silent anymore. She decided to testify against her husband, a move that would expose the dark truth behind his perfect facade. The trial of Julian Kane was swift and unforgiving. As the evidence piled up, Mia's phone recordings, the details of his previous relationships, and Claire's testimony, it became clear that Julian had murdered MIA in cold blood. The court heard about his manipulation, his control, and his obsession with silencing anyone who dared to defy him. When the verdict was read, Julian was convicted of Mia's murder, along with the deaths of the women who had crossed his path. He was sentenced to life in prison, his once charismatic demeanor now replaced with the cold, empty stare of a man who had lost everything. The aftermath of Mia's death was profound. Her family, her friends, and even the world of aviation were left in shock. MIA had been a rising star, a woman with a future. And now, all that was left were the haunting memories of what could have been. For Mia's family, the loss was devastating. Her parents, who had always supported her dreams, were left grappling with the brutal reality that their daughter had been taken from them. And for her best friend, Sarah, the guilt was unbearable. She had known something was wrong, but she had never suspected it would end like this. As for Claire, the woman who had once stood by Julian's side, her life had been shattered. The man she had loved, the man she had built her life with, was not the person she thought he was. But through her testimony, she found some small measure of justice for the woman who had suffered in silence. The days following Julian Kane's arrest were filled with media frenzy and public shock. A man who had been admired and respected by so many in the aviation industry, a man who was seen as a picture of charm and success, had turned out to be a monster hiding behind a polished facade. Julian's arrest was swift, but it was not without its consequences. The investigation into his life was extensive, uncovering a trail of victims spanning years. The women who had once adored him, who had once believed in the promise of his affection, had all been silenced one way or another. As the details of his crimes were revealed, it became clear that Julian had spent most of his life manipulating, controlling, and discarding women. He had never been truly interested in love. For him, it was all about ownership, about power. MIA Chandler had been no different. She had been just another woman to be broken and discarded when she dared to defy him. The court trial was grueling. Julian's defense team tried to paint him as a victim of circumstance, claiming that MIA had been mentally unstable and that her death had been an accident, just another tragic mishap between lovers. But the evidence was overwhelming. Mia's final moments had been captured on video, and Julian's chilling confession to his role in Lily Matthews' death left no room for doubt. The prosecution argued that Julian had systematically used his position of power to manipulate MIA, to isolate her from her loved ones, and, when she finally tried to escape, to eliminate her. They presented evidence of his many affairs, his violent outbursts, and his complete lack of remorse. Claire Kane, Julian's estranged wife, became the key witness in the case. Her testimony was heartbreaking. For years, Claire had lived under Julian's control, blind to the full extent of his cruelty. But when she discovered the truth about his affairs, and the murder of MIA, she found the strength to break free from her own silence. She described how Julian had constantly lied to her, how he had used her to maintain his public image while secretly tormenting other women behind closed doors. Claire's decision to testify against her husband was not an easy one, but it was the only way she could begin to heal from the wreckage of their marriage. The courtroom was filled with emotion as the final arguments were made. Mia's family sat together, their faces drawn with grief but also with the faint glimmer of justice. Sarah, Mia's best friend, sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had never fully understood the depth of Mia's relationship with Julian, and now, with the truth exposed, the weight of her own guilt was unbearable. Could she have done something sooner? Could she have saved her friend? As the jury deliberated, the tension in the air was palpable. The prosecution had presented a damning case, but would Julian's charisma and manipulative tactics win him a more lenient sentence? It felt as though justice had already been denied for far too long. Finally, the jury returned, and the courtroom fell into an eerie silence. We, the jury, find the defendant, Julian Kane, guilty of the murder of MIA Chandler. The words hit like a hammer. Mia's family exhaled collectively, a mix of relief and sorrow filling the room. It was the first step toward justice, but it would never bring MIA back. Julian's sentencing hearing followed immediately. He was convicted of first-degree murder, as well as charges related to his past relationships and the deaths he had caused to keep his secrets hidden. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Julian's once pristine image had been shattered, and now, he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. As he was escorted out of the courtroom, Julian's face was expressionless. The man who had once commanded the attention of every room he entered was now a shadow of his former self. There were no more smiles, no more charm. His true nature had been exposed for all to see. MIA Chandler was gone, and though justice had been served, her death left a permanent scar on the people who loved her. Her family would never recover from the loss of their daughter, their sister. Her friends would carry the weight of her memory with them, knowing that MIA had been a victim not just of Julian, but of a system that had allowed a man like him to thrive for so long. For Sarah, the pain was particularly sharp. She had been there for MIA through everything, their ups and downs, the successes and the heartaches. But she had never seen what was happening behind closed doors, never suspected the darkness that lurked beneath Julian's charming exterior. She had known that MIA was in a relationship with Julian, but she had never imagined it could lead to this. Now, all she had were the memories of their friendship and the bitter realization that she had failed to protect her. Mia's legacy would not be one of victimhood, however. Her death had sparked a conversation about abuse, control, and manipulation in relationships, particularly in the world of power dynamics and work-related affairs. MIA had been a talented and driven woman, someone with dreams and ambitions. Her tragic end had become a catalyst for change. In the wake of her death, several organizations dedicated to supporting victims of domestic violence and workplace abuse received an outpouring of donations and support. Mia's story was shared across social media, a warning to others who might find themselves in similar situations. Her name, once known only in the shadows of tabloid gossip, became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that no one should have to live under the control of another person, no matter how powerful they may seem. For Claire Kane, the fallout from Julian's arrest had been just as traumatic as the investigation itself. She had spent years in denial, unwilling to confront the truth about her husband. But once she had come to terms with what he had done, Claire felt a deep responsibility to make sure his crimes were exposed. Despite everything, Claire did not leave the courtroom as a broken woman. She left with a sense of purpose, one that came from knowing that she had helped bring an end to Julian's reign of terror. She would never be able to undo the years of pain and deception, but she had found the courage to take a stand. For the first time in years, she felt free. MIA Chandler's story is one of love, betrayal, and ultimate tragedy. Her life was taken by the man she had trusted, the man who had promised her everything, only to strip it all away. But in the end, it was her courage that spoke the loudest. Even as she struggled in the final moments of her life, she had been determined to protect her child, and to break free from the grip of a man who had controlled her every move. Her death was not in vain. Mia's story had a lasting impact on everyone who knew her, and it would forever serve as a stark reminder of the dangers that can lurk in relationships built on control, manipulation, and obsession. Though she is gone, Mia's legacy lives on in the hearts of those who loved her, and in the lives of those who will be saved by the lessons her tragedy taught.